Okay, now from there, I'm a huge fan of distortion on bass guitars. I think bass sounds amazing when it's crushed. And in for this particular music, I thought it was really suitable for it. So I used Logic's pedal board again. And the reason I did that was because in this particular instance, Logic has these awesome pedals for splitting the signal, where the clean signal hits the splitter, it's split into two. One side of the signal gets the distortion, the other side remains clean, and then you can blend how much of clean and distortion that you want. So let's listen. So I had it pretty much 50-50, a little more towards the side of clean. That might sound a bit gnarly to you, but I think it sounds really great in the mix. Let's hear it with the drums. All right. So now I wanted to fill out the bass guitar with the sound of a bass amp or an emulated bass amp. So what I actually did was I copied the bass track. I made a new track, copied the regions to the new track, the new track, and I put the same exact plugins, the channel EQ, the compressor, the pedal board with the same ratio of distortion. But now I use Space Designer again, but this time I wanted to emulate a cabinet, either guitar or bass. I don't know what it's supposed to be emulating, but I went through the presets and I found the one that sounded the best to me. This is what this cab sounds like on its own. I actually think that sounds so amazing and gnarly. So now, at this point, I want to blend the two together. Here's the issue when it comes to this sort of thing, whether this is a real bass amp, is you're going to run into the problem of phase issues. So let's listen. That sounds horrendous. And the reason that it sounds horrendous is because these are emulating cables that are being routed to pedals, cables that are being routed to amp cabinets, a cabinet with a microphone with a cable running to an interface. And just think of it in real life too, that is actually doing that. The fact is all of this extra stuff adds a time delay to the signal of the amp version of the bass, where the DI is just plugged directly into the interface and you're just tracking directly from the bass to the interface. It has so much less to go to deliver that signal to your computer, where the amp, it's got to travel significantly further to get that signal to your computer. And that's why the phasey, nasty sound. So I cheated a little bit with this particular session, and I used a plugin from a company called Melda. And they have a plugin that I bought called Auto Align. And what you do is you set the group of the tracks. So I set it to B for bass track. You copy it to both the bass DI and the bass amp. And what happens is I'll hit play, and then I'm going to hit analyze to analyze the incoming signals between the two instruments within the group. And then auto align will determine the amount of sound delay that one of these tracks is going to need to line up for the best sounding presentation of the bass. Let's try it. So the low end is totally much better representation with auto align's capabilities. Now, auto align, I've noticed from Melda, is that like the values sometimes differ depending on which section of the song that you are analyzing. So let's look at this. Okay, so this is off by about 3 samples from that. So I used to agonize over these sort of things. I used to invert the phase of the bass DI, and then I would play with a sample delay plugin like this one that does the exact same thing as this, except it doesn't analyze the signal. Instead, I would listen to the 2 tracks inverted and then try to move this knob around to the point where I felt like the most cancellation was going on, where the bass sounded the thinnest. And remember, the polarity is inverted. So when it sounds the thinnest, inverted, when you reverse the polarity back to where it started, it should sound its fullest. So for just to fill you in, a Logic Gain plugin has a phase invert or polarity invert. So let's just take this off. I would hit play and I would invert the phase. And then what I would do with the sample delay is I would just drag it up and down and try to find the point where these 2 tracks sound their thinnest. Now, that's all well and good, but I can tell you from firsthand experience and hours and hours and hours and hours of me doing this is that it is very difficult to ascertain the best spot sometimes for these multi-mic'd instruments. Like, I use auto align on the drums to tighten up the time differences between different drum mics. And when you're trying to adjust by 20 samples, even 252 samples, it can be like splitting hairs. And you're listening to this kaleidoscope of audio colors go by while you're adjusting the sample delay plugin in terms of samples, which samples are so tiny. They're much smaller than milliseconds. So it gets real confusing fast. I find electric guitars a lot easier to manipulate in this way. And it's a good thing too, because auto align doesn't seem to read distorted electric guitars that well in its analyzing mode. So I bought this plugin. There's one from a company called Sound Radix called auto align as well that does the exact same thing. But instead I can just hit analyze, it analyzes it, and then I can just sort of fine tune it from there. So I came to this value of 249 samples, and then Logic has in their delay menu this plugin called sample delay. So then I just copied and pasted that value to this plugin, so I didn't have a third-party plugin within this session. So let's listen. Much better. Okay, now I'm not going to have the bass that loud personally. Let's listen against the drums. So loud. And to me, it doesn't sound like the bass is really there yet tonally anyways. So I brought the bass amp all the way down, and most of my signal is coming from the DI. And I'm just going to fill it out a little bit with the amp by bringing it up slowly. There you go.